My name is Ryan Villasmil, and this is my presentation on how does horror movies change society's views on certain aspects of violence, sex, and drugs contained within them. Horror movies have always had some sort of controversy around it, with its violence and gory scenes upsetting the masses. This causes research to be conducted on the subject. Still, many of the studies that have been conducted on horror movies themselves have been concentrated on the negative effects that it has on people, as mentioned in Sultan et al. 2021, stating that horror movies can cause individuals mental and even physical harm. One detail that was prominent throughout all the research was exposure. It was linked to many of the studies revolving around horror. Many people questioned whether exposure was an answer to many of the questions that revolved around horror as a whole. However, through all of this research, there's been a lack of studies done on the social effects of horror movies, whether the actual content shown that is affecting changing our lasting opinions on the content that is shown. So this poses the question, why does this question matter? The significance of this question stems from our changing society. Society is an ever-evolving place that can cause lasting effects and changes to the individual. Large-scale changes within a society in some cases can cause harmful adverse effects spreading rapidly, and in a day and age where social media is so prominent, it can change in an instant. Considering recent events that are ongoing in our world, it is important to have a great understanding of our society. While we can't get a perfect understanding, learning about certain portions of it can provide a much needed information that we can use in the future. Along with this, our generation has experienced a trend of becoming numb to many of the emotions that we exhibit. This numbness has also been seen to follow people's opinions on certain content, with people becoming okay with the idea of gore, violence, and even death. Events such as this have caused the genre of horror to be horror some way in societies, always had causing a controversy always follows it. To conduct my research, I wanted to begin with a genre analysis of horror as a whole. Before beginning the actual experiment of my research, I wanted to establish the key rhetorical moves that makes horror movies what they are. I was able to do this by conducting a genre analysis on the genre horror, looking at different movies across a genre and highlighting similarities and differences between them to pinpoint elements that every horror movie has. Some of those horror movies I decided to look at were Halloween 2018, Saw from 2004, Friday the 13th from 1980, and Hereditary from 2018. Some of the common elements that were shown in these movies was that there was an excess amount of blood and gore, highlighting gender roles and racial stereotypes, and even drug and sex. It was important to establish the elements or content that is shown in many of the horror movies, as it will allow for a better understanding of how this graphic content can affect one's opinions, as well as will allow me to create and structure my research methodology more accurately to get a more in-depth answers. My next part of my research was surveys. My main reasoning for conducting these surveys that would allow me to gain a broader opinion of my topic from many different people from varying backgrounds, allowing me to gain different types of data that I can use to generalize claims. My participants were asked varying questions ranging from whether they liked or had watched horror movies, questions about their feelings before mentioning horror movies, how they felt about graphic content in movies, and their reasons for liking or disliking horror movies. I constructed these questions to gain answers and opinions on general knowledge, whether one group sided with a specific opinion, whether the graphic content in horror movies changed our opinion of the material, and lastly, whether any outside factors influence these opinions. My survey was conducted on a Google form where the only personal information that that had to be provided was their age, as I needed to know if they were 18 plus due to the nature of their questions. Then I layered the questions to be asked in a manner where they were asked for their opinions on the graphic content before I mentioned horror movies there to not create a lopsided data. Some of the survey data that I received that were notable was that 80% of participants said that they at least watched a horror movie. 60% of participants said that they liked watching horror movies. 40% of participants stated that outlying factors prohibited from watching any horror movies. And 40% of participants stated that they viewed graphic content in horror movies to be too vulgar and out of line. Along with 60% of participants stated that the graphic content in horror movies is graphic as they included violence, but they didn't change their perception of how they felt about this content in real life. And lastly, 20% of participants stated that the content in real life is wrongful, but it doesn't bother them as much in horror movies, agreeing with their opinion while answering the question about horror movies that contain graphic content and viewing them as fun or cool. One of the limitations about my survey is that participants could have easily lied about their feeling towards horror movies to the side, specifically to one side. Another limitation of my survey is that I can't generalize the society specifically. Can't generalize society specifically as I only collected data on broader terms. To get into the data analysis of my survey, one of the first themes that I created during my data was exposure. I had countless participants describe their experience with horror through the exposure that they had throughout their life or lack thereof, which influenced how much they liked the genre, affecting how they felt about graphic content after viewing it. Some of the patterns I viewed were more participants exposed to negative or positive viewpoints on horror continue to exhibit these feelings later on in life. Only a couple of cases did some of my participants state that their opinions changed as they lived their lives. This helped me gain an insight that one of the biggest motivators causing people's perceptions of this content to change after watching horror movies may be how much they were exposed to horror movies, the prominence in their life, or whether they were exposed to preconceptions of horror from a young age. Another theme I was able to develop through the analysis of my data was a change in one's mindset about graphic content. In horror movies, entirely depending on the individual. One of the first questions that I asked my survey was whether the participants liked horror movies and why or why not. This allowed me to gain the insight on whether people liked or disliked horror movies. On average, 72% of my participants liked horror movies while 28% didn't. And when following these individuals, those who liked horror movies tended to be more numb when it came to this type of graphic content in the real world, but there were participants that liked horror movies who found this graphic content as too much in the real world. This provided me insight on varying opinions within a group can exist because one's feelings about horror movies, leading to the possible questioning whether it has to do more with one's personal feelings or the actual nature of the genre itself. One of the last opinions that I observed when looking back at my data from my research is that many participants mentioned how outside factors swayed their opinions on horror movie, in turn creating preconceptions that they have now. This theme goes hand in hand with exposure but goes into much more detail on the specific factors that participants mentioned in my survey, such as phobias, not being allowed to, or even appeal from the horror movies themselves to be reasons that the graphic content that many horror movies surround themselves in turn causing people to believe that horror movies are bad for society because of content that they push, allowing me to gain insight that maybe outside factors out of the control of the genre itself gives horror movies a bad reputation, propelling the thought that it's causing harm to our society. In conclusion, my research yielded results that back the research around exposure being a prominent factor in whether people in general like horror movies and feel the effects synonymous to them. In turn, this leads to the point that the effects that graphic content has on the user is entirely dependent on the person themselves, as other outlying factors out of my control, such as the person and their upbringing, can create preconceived notions about horror and its effect on our opinion. While not having the largest effect on our view of graphic content, horror movies still have a way to influence our viewpoint on this content in slight ways. With more research needs to be done on this topic to pinpoint what these areas of effect are. The future of this topic is unknown as there's very little research conducted on it. To begin, I believe that more research needs to be conducted on this topic as a whole, as it can provide valuable answers and expand on our knowledge of social effects that content has on our society, as well as provide valuable lessons to us as a society to not only allow us as a society to grow, but benefit individuals itself. One thing is certain, a genre as big as horror will never go away. It will continue to prosper and be a part of our society for many years to come, bringing changes that we've never seen before. And here are my resources. Thank you.